Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by Bodhi Moore from far away in Australia. She has a new self-help book for women called Healing Your Attachment Wounds, a guide to healing what's hidden in your attachment style and relationships. It says here that it's an insightful guide, offers a comprehensive understanding of how to identify and heal attachment scars, thereby fostering healthier relationships. It provides a wealth of strategies to resolve negative parental attachments, detach from childhood trauma, and heal toxic attachments. I'm sure everyone listening will probably need this. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you very much. I feel very blessed to be here. So thank you again.
Good. Well, yes, I appreciate that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to write this book?
All right. Well, jumping right in, I was married for 37 years to in a relationship I imagined was happy and secure. And it turns out after my 30th wedding anniversary, I found out that my husband was in an affair. And so he walked out and came back, and we spent another 7 years together. And eventually I got the courage to leave. So out there on the road, I did discover certain things about myself. I left, got in the car, put my canoe on the roof, and traveled by myself up and down the east coast of Australia and house sat and so forth, just to kind of get my groove back, to figure out what I wanted to do. And over the years that followed, I did date one more guy, and he happened to have a drinking problem, which became my drinking problem there while I was with him for the 12 months. And I noticed that I was wounded and that I was making bad choices around the men, and I was trying to figure out, I'd lost connection to my own children. And I bring this out in the book, though I didn't want to bring it out. That was part of my healing. I used the book. So literally the books were written for an audience of one, which was me. I found that I wanted to figure out why I was doing what I was doing. And I felt that I couldn't fix what I couldn't see. So I could see this gap between myself and my children. And I was just such a broken woman from all of that. And I thought, well, how do I get my life back on track? And certainly I had in the book I mentioned, I had my dark moments where I figure it's not worth trying. And I come back from that revelation. And then I started digging in and finding out what those wounds look like for me, and then translating them, finding the science behind it, and then translating that into books that would be healing books. Primarily, I was aiming at women because I was writing it for an audience of women myself, and that was where the research came from. So my first book was Women Going Sober. That was my first foray into, I had spent the last 40 years, more or less, not being as creative as I would have liked to. I've always wanted to write. I have in a previous life done some writing, and that we don't need to talk about it here, but I have worked and written extensively over other subject matter. But for this particular time, coming back from being broken, from being disintegrated by all the things that happened in my life, I decided that I would go dry for a month. I did Dry July, and then from Dry July, I decided to write a book, Women Going Sober, and that included women's stories, not just mine. And then when I saw my disconnection with my daughter and so forth, and daughters rather, I realized that I needed to do the work that was all about how could I find my way back. And so Healing Your Attachment Wounds started to take shape. It took me down some really dark holes to get there, but and that's the second book. I call it the Sisterhood series, really, because it comes back to my understanding that a lot of the time we do this work on our own. I know when I was in that awful place, I didn't have friends. I didn't have one girlfriend to go to in my moment. And we need these people in our lives. We need a sisterhood, or we need a brotherhood around us. We need these good folk in our lives looking after us. And if I'd had that, I think I might have been able to make better choices. So I just pulled it together and called it the Sisterhood series in terms of developing that and exploring that further. So the books really bring in science and storytelling, spirituality and sisterhood. All those things kind of meld together. And we have the book Healing Your Attachment Wounds, which is again really designed for women and men. I shouldn't have focused only on women, because it does work for men too. And the men that have reviewed the book have found it to be very, very helpful. So it's really, I'm in my 60s, mid 60s now. So I think the take home is that to be unaware of that so late in my life, I just don't know how that's possible, but it obviously is. How we can get to in our 60s and not realize that we're wounded, and or that what those wounds look like, or how we got them in the first place. So that's,
well, I mean, I think it's important to remember a lot of this stuff around attachment style, love languages, all this type of thing is very new. My Nana, who's almost exactly 20 years older than you, it was on the forefront, a lot of this stuff with a lot of these thinkers in these books in the early 80s. So there's, even from my generation, it hadn't really reached the pop culture awareness that it has now when we were growing up. So we're still, learning a lot of this stuff, figuring a lot of this stuff out, understanding, unpacking what it means for us, our lives, unpacking what our parents have done, all this type of thing. And so that, I think, is I grace on that point, because if no one ever hands you a book like this, if no one ever comes along and said, hey, maybe try this, whatever have you, then you've never had the chance to learn. So it came to you at the moment you needed it, which I think is beautiful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cameron. And look, I say to my daughters, because I have been able to make my way back to them through the work, being able to re-engage, when you can reconnect, when you start healing your wounds, that's the power of this. And I said to my daughter, I apologize for the mothering, and I go deeply into my own story to create, to show examples of where those different styles show up in our friends and our family and our children. You start to see the anxious or the avoidant, different styles of attachment. And I said to my daughter, look, I am so sorry that I wasn't the mother you wanted or perhaps needed. But I said, stand on my shoulders and do better. That's what this book is about, parenting differently so that you see these beautiful souls. I could not say, like I loved mothering, I loved it. But only as a nanny do I see the beautiful souls in my grandchildren in a way I wished I'd seen them as a parent. And that's my maturity. And I think I see my daughter in her 30s, like you are, Cameron. She's got this beautiful maturity. Both of them have this beautiful maturity in them, that they are now parenting beautifully. And in fact, I said to my daughter the other day, I said, I wish you'd been my mother. I wish you'd been my mother, because things would have been different. But again, we are where we are. I wouldn't have written a book without all these different pathways that take us here.
Well, yeah, and also there's a lot of this stuff that is quite cultural as well. And culture has changed a lot in a relative short, period of time. And one of the things I love about Australia is it's this, I always kind of look at it as this weird amalgamation of kind of like Britain and the United States. And sometimes it's the best of both of our countries, and sometimes it's the worst.
It's the worst.
and I think I think a lot of that, not talking about feelings, just getting on with it, sort of thing, that was extremely pervasive till about 30 years ago, I think left a lot of people bereft of how to handle emotions, process emotions, all this type of thing. And those, if you don't do it in a healthy way, it will manifest itself in an unhealthy way. You're gonna process the emotion. That's baked in. But how you do it hovers favorably on what tools you have what tools you
Absolutely.
have to do it, you
The
know.
body is keeping tabs, and it will bring you to your
Yes.
knees one way or the other. And you're right. Our culture here, sometimes in Australia, I'm ashamed of some of the things that get out into the media. I'd like to think the majority of us are not quite like that, or as racist as that. But anyway, that's another conversation. I do feel that, yes, you're right. In my and growing up, emotions were a liability. You weren't really
Yeah.
allowed to have emotions. You weren't allowed to show them. You smacked around if you cried or whatever. And I was listening to a young woman yesterday who was parenting her child, and my ears pricked up when she said to me, I couldn't get my daughter to behave herself, so I locked her outside. And my heart just broke for that little child locked outside. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, this is. I'm not saying that we can change it in maybe not in my lifetime, but to be able to have a child. I love it when I look at my grandchildren and I say to them every chance I get, you are absolutely perfect the way you are. You don't need to change a thing, and there's nothing you could do that could possibly stop my love for you. If we'd heard that growing up, I never heard from my mother, I love you, till I was 50. In my 50s. Yeah. And it came about because I said to her I loved her. I came back and I was determined to stop this generational trauma. I wanted to come back, and I could see it repeating itself from generation to generation. I was doing exactly what my mother was doing, and I was getting the exact same response from my own children, who now, like you, in their 30s, were articulating how it hurt them and where it wounded them. And how I wasn't the mother I thought I was, and how my behavior. She said to me, Mum, one day you walked in and you slapped me across the face. And now I know I did a lot of good stuff for them, but they're remembering the slap across the face. It was traumatic. I don't remember who that woman was that slapped him across the face, because she's not here now. But that woman who parented them was doing the best that she could. And I was traumatized in my own way. And we then start imprinting our children with that. And that's the part we're trying to, I think, my wish for the book is that it helps us stop in our tracks and go back and do the work on ourselves, because it's all on ourselves. It is the work that we have to do. I believe that we live in a world that reflects who we are. And so as we start to heal our wounds and change it, we make different choices. Our relationships can heal. Some relationships, they just disappear. They're not meant for us. But it is, stand on our shoulders. And for those of us in my generation, we have to say sorry. We have to stop it. I went back to my mother and I apologized for being the awful child that I was. Now, the caveat to that is I was behaving the way I was out of my wounds. But that didn't mean I didn't hurt my parents. Like, I ran away and eloped in America and didn't tell my mother I'd left. And, I married an African-American and lived in the United States for a number of years. And that set off a whole chain of trauma in itself. But it wasn't about the blame. Go back. And when I heard her story, I could see where her wounds were. And she was acting out to the best that she could within her wounds. So we held each other. We had a cry, and I said, I'm sorry, Mum. And it stops. And I say sorry to all the people. I make restitution for the pain. And my feeling right now is I don't want to go through life causing anyone any pain. So I'll do the work to try and stop that. Now, obviously I can't do that for everyone, but certainly live with love. Live with love.
Absolutely. And that generational piece is so important. I wrote a whole book loosely based on my grandmother's life, and it took me getting into her life, her mother's life, and her children's lives, in order for me to understand these things don't start with us. and I noticed, some people made some decisions in 1954 that hurt grandma and my mom and me. And and I'm in a better place now. I've gone to therapy, all this type of thing. And I was able to kind of offer to my mom a gift when I sat her down. I said, "You were not well served by your parents. They did not give you what you needed. You were not well served by them. I am the only person in our entire family who has the wherewithal to say that." And it's one of those things where she's not necessarily in the place to receive that at a necessarily super deep level. But I think in the space of things, in the energy of things, at some level, her subconscious is going to hear that and be like, someone sees you. I see. Yeah. I've seen this. I took 5 years to write about it. I see this, and yet you were not well served by them. Yeah. And this is prescient. Her father recently passed. And I said, yeah, you were not well served by them, and you were not a priority in the way that you should have been, and all of those things. Yes, I see it. I validate it. It's all true. Yes.
What a gift. What a gift that was for her, Cameron, because again, we don't feel seen. We don't feel seen. And again, the trauma gets hidden, it gets pushed down. You've obviously done the work yourself. You said you've done the work yourself in...
Yeah, I mean, I spent most of my 20s in therapy and spiritual practice, trying to fix myself, and kind of found out later on it was all just sparkling autism. But I also, I had a very tough childhood with a lot of trauma, and that had to, that really had to get resolved before I could move on and do anything else. And so it's been kind of this whole, from 2009 to 2021, this kind of whole mental health journey over these years, and and talking to people and trying medication and doing different things, and having a lot of really heavy realizations at a very young age about myself, family, all this type of thing that honestly one really shouldn't do till their 40s. But when have I ever followed the rules? Never. So there I am at 25, trying to individuate and find my own personality outside of my birth family, while also healing multi-generational family trauma. And also just, and accepting, getting to the place where I could, accept a major diagnosis, getting to the place where I could say, okay, I'm beginning to see the context of all of this. And sometimes you have to change the relationship with people as well. I always tell close friends, the best day of my life was when I quit asking my mother to be my mother. That relieved her that relieved us both of a terrible burden. I quit being unhappy at her not mothering, and she quit having to try to pretend to attempt to do it. And so, so now we're just kind of friends, and it's much better this way.
Because you're calling it out. You're calling it out, and it's no pretending.
No, there was a true. I lived with them for a couple of years. There was this great moment when I was kind of feeling sick and wasn't feeling that well, and she's like, "Would you like something to eat?" I'm like, yeah, that would actually be great if you're going to Panda Express, like bring me some, all this type of thing. And she comes back and she's kind of like, here's your food. And I'm like, inside I'm thinking, we should never do this ever again. This is way too close to mothering for you. This is not good. We should not do this.
Oh my goodness.
And so it's just those, and I look at this, I mean, like, yeah, like, I'm, spent so many years, being like, it's supposed to be this, you're not doing any of these things. Why not? And having all this emotional stuff to realize, the best thing to do is kind of like, that's, and it took time and age to realize that's just not who she is. No, never was. No,
and she's
ain't gonna be. So,
and let's just say she has a story, and there would be, there would be a great deal of dysfunctionality where parts of her fell away at a very young age.
No, her mother went through 2 divorces before she was 18. That's traumatic. That's traumatic. Absolutely. Which is why I say your parents did not serve you well. Yeah. My mother was her own caregiver while also caring for her 3 younger siblings. That's why I say your parents did not serve you well.
No. And you know,
And
and
that's
look,
unfortunate.
I've got a parent, Cameron, who's my mother's 90 something now. She's not going to change. I parent
No.
my mother now. I mother my mother, and I love doing it. And you know, when I go to see her, this is the woman I talk about in my book who was my nemesis because she just ruled the roost. They see her with such tenderness now, and I bring to her the things that she never had growing up. So it's such an opportunity to forgive and to give her. She does not have it in her to meet my needs. I don't expect her to, but I will try and meet hers in the last years of her life. And I think that's the upshift in our spirituality, in our you know, that we show that love and tenderness because we have that capacity when we get
Oh, and I
past
think
our own pain.
and I think that's so important because there's so many people now who are going through that, who have, because people are living so long now. You end up, you know, really end up with elderly parents for a long time. My Nana is 84. She lives in assisted living. You know, her oldest is now in his 60s. So, you know, this is how it goes. And you know, and so and half the grandkids are in our 30s now. So that's, you know, it's so yeah, so it's a, you know, it's a very different it's a very different thing. But I think the great thing, and this is where my mother had a tough time. Her mother died very young. She had a lot of health issues and died when she was 64. There was not the time. And I told her a couple years ago, I said, I wish grandma were still alive because I would force her to apologize for you. I would sit in her house and berate her until she gave that to you because you deserve it. She did not serve you well, and I wish she were here. I would literally not leave her house until she made amends because I get it now. In a way that I didn't younger. I had to get old enough to see it in its whole context, to understand it, to be like, oh, I get it now. It's not just about, and for me, it was bigger than myself. I finally got to the place where I realized the story is bigger than me. There's all these other people, all these other players. This started 30 years before I was born. And it completely changed the perspective.
Well, I mean, the science is proving also, Cameron, that we're bringing through those intergenerational, but millennia through our DNA. That trauma is coming through our DNA, and I don't know about you.
I'm African American. That's a whole other conversation.
Well, so I mentioned in my book, my children are half and half. They're African American as well, on their father's side. And
me too. That's my mother's white, my father's black. I'm the same mix.
And I found it really challenging. You know, the racism that my children endured at school and seeing that white privilege and being that white privilege and trying to get in. Like I said, that's a whole different conversation. But it is a wound in itself. It wounds, and I go into that in the book as to how that was. But
my next book of fiction is a historical novel set in 1850, based on the plantation my family comes from in central Mississippi.
Yes.
And so it's like writing about my relatives, really. And it is, and that's one of the things that when you talk about epigenetics and generational trauma, you see this with grandchildren of Holocaust survivors.
Absolutely. Yes.
Small children have terribly traumatic visions of, you know, chasing after train cars rolling away from their village in Poland or whatever have you. And, you know, grandmama's like, how on earth would you ever know that that's what we went through? But it's there. It's still. And so it's like, what does 250 years of forced servitude, forced breeding, beatings, all this type of thing do to a population of people? And that's not just in this country, that's Caribbean diaspora. We're talking 25 million people who were descended from these terrible institutions. What does that do to a people, to a civilization? And only just now are we having the conversations to begin to heal that.
Exactly. And I think we get to a point where now we're at least acknowledging it, you know, and look, there is, I think, I find with me sometimes that the suffering just wafts through me, and you can't even bring it down to a particular place or thing that's causing that emotion, and it feels like it's it comes from millennia back that you're unpacking suffering and you're trying to lay it down so that you can move everyone on and upshift. And I think that's really the challenge, which I am just thrilled beyond when I listen to what you're doing, Cameron, in terms of you're the it's going to rest on your shoulders to help, once we're gone, to help change this. And we do need to have this conversation. And yes, it's not easy to do the work, because it takes, therapy and whatever else you want, to whatever other modality you want to get involved in. But it is about changing it slowly and having those conversations. I love that you said you'd make your grandmother own up to her behavior.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's
I don't know
that
my kids would do that.
No, I mean, that's the terrible thing in families is you have a lot of secrets. You have a lot of stuff that doesn't get said. And bearing in mind, and my grandmother didn't have the language to talk about this. She grew up on a farm in eastern Colorado, which is like the middle of Australia, flat and dry, with grass and wheat. That's all that's out there. There's nothing else out there. And, and they grew up, she was born in 1938 at the tail end of the Depression. The Dust Bowl, Darragh County was deeply affected by it. So there was clouds of terrible dust, all this type of thing, which I know y'all have down there. And dust storms every day. And then there was the war. And that was a very dicey thing for a long time. And and then in the years after that, and there was no time while we were defeating the Nazis and the Japanese at the same time to have conversations about feelings. We have to build 12 Liberty ships a day, and they were growing sugar beets, and almost all of their crop went to the war effort. It was grain granulated and sent to Europe or sent to the Pacific. And so there just was not the tools for all of that.
No.
And that's why I say, you have
to. But we
to
have them now. I think we're developing them now. And that's just so, that we're having the conversation. We understand, even the talk around spirituality, understanding that we come, even I love that neuroscience is proving that we come in with a certain amount of spirituality embedded in us. And we need to develop that too, understanding that we're part of something bigger than just ourselves. And that's that quest is be bigger, think more broadly in terms of the social consciousness. We have a place in this, and we have to, not have to, wrong words, but I'd say we have a responsibility to try and contribute back, to be of service to others, if not at least our families, to start there and push it out to our communities. And that starts with, again, healing, bringing the best of us out, and then taking that out to the world.
Yes, and not only that, but, and we've talked a lot about families and all this type of thing, but I wanted particularly to focus in our closing moments when it comes to relationship attachments. How did you begin to deal with your 30-year marriage and the end of that and all this? How did you begin to heal that and figure that out? And do you have a new man?
No, I don't have a new man. And I've kind of not really focused on men now at the moment. I do still feel like that big love is out there for me, but my life is okay without one. I feel like I'm on service. I feel like I want to make my life count, and I'm more than happy to just invest in the work that I'm doing right now, writing these books and having conversations. I love that. I obviously will be guided to where that takes me. But in terms of my marriage, I thought I was madly in love. I was in love with my husband, who's now no longer my husband, but the man I was in love with every day of my marriage for 37 years. I loved him right till the end. And when I tried to drive out the driveway, I got to the end of the street and I couldn't leave. I had all my car packed and I could not leave. I had to have a girlfriend come and grab me. It's just so profound, codependency, that the notion that you're in love with being in love. I can't explain it. And that's where I understood that I had all sorts of problems I needed to deal with. But it's not love. When you have a healthy love of yourself, you wouldn't put up with half of that. I should have left years ago. There were so many. He was in more than one affair. The letters arrived. I had death threats at home. He was in more than one affair, but I looked at this man and saw integrity. There was no integrity there, but I imprinted that integrity on him. And I thought he couldn't possibly lie to me. So I took myself off to the therapist. I got the work because it had to be me. My instincts were going off. And so just after our 30th wedding anniversary, we had renewed our vows in front of our children and grandchildren. I found out that he was in a 2-year affair and he left. He stripped the house of everything and he just left and left me in our family home. And of course, I disintegrated. Then 6 weeks later, he asked, could he come back? He said he'd made a big mistake. Could he come back? My mistake was taking him back, because if I had that sisterhood around me talking, some common sense into me, I would have said, no, don't come, and I would have got my life. It would have taken a different track. But this is the wounds we make silly decisions, and I wasted another 7 years. So that's where the book came from.
No, I have a lot of my friends who got married young have been divorcing. I've had 4 divorces in my life in the last couple years. The pandemic was hard on a lot of people. Some of them I knew 10 years ago they were getting divorced. They just hadn't caught up to themselves yet. Yes, others of them were a total surprise. So I'm kind of like you two have been together since before I knew you. How is this even possible? And so it's been interesting seeing it from the inside. I actually kicked off the pandemic with a really nasty breakup. And I ended up homeless and traveled the country for 6 months during a pandemic, 8,850 miles coast to coast for 6 months in 2020. Yeah.
In your car? In your car?
Yeah. In fact, one of my cars died. I had to buy a new one in Tennessee.
Spirit.
Yeah, it was. I got to see this country from a perspective most people will never ever see ever again. And it'll be in my upcoming travel book. And all this sort of thing. And so it's just romantic relationships are so incredibly hard. They're so incredibly difficult. So when you say, oh yeah, I took him back and we went for 7 more years, I'm not surprised. I rented from a lady whose husband was in the submarine corps and would go out to sea and not give her any money. And she had 3 kids at home. And that only changed when literally the US Navy command forced him to give her money, like under threat of imprisonment. And they were married for 38 years. I'm kind of like, Jesus. Honey, I would have been gone at year 2.
I know.
But I mean, but I also think people forget, and I think younger people judge their parents' generation. People don't understand what it used to be like for women. If you weren't married and attached to a man, you didn't exist in this world, and that was true for my mother's 68. That was true for her generation. It was definitely true for her mother's generation. And so, unfortunately,
we were taught to acquiesce.
Yes.
We were taught to acquiesce to everything. And that was what came with my second relationship. I had, like you, when COVID hit, I took off and drove around the countryside and ended up living in a caravan in the high country with my man off grid. And he would say to me, when he'd say, what do you want? I'd go, well, what do you want? And he'd say, do you realize what you do? You do that all the time. You acquiesce to me, to everything. And I thought, there it is, right there. I've been doing that all my life. All my life I've been thinking, what is someone else's needs? They're more important than mine. Yeah. So no, I don't have a man in my life because I want to learn. I'm learning for the first time what I want and how authentic. And look, I did mention in my book, in terms of men, I find if there's a list of things I want in my man, I have that list. But what I'm committed to doing is building that in me first. I'm developing those attributes in me so that I attract a man that is worthy of me. When I get, I'm almost there, can I say? I've kind of done the work, but I don't want to be in a relationship that's anything short of authentic, loving and caring and upbuilt. I want to be able to love a man with all that love and know that he's coming back loving me with all that love, with all his love, and then bang, we had this wonderful relationship. I've not had that yet. Maybe I might never have it, but certainly I feel, as I said, go back to the inner work. I want to develop in me the very traits I want in the man I want to marry or even just meet. And when I get there, possibly he may show up. But if he doesn't show up, that's okay, because I've learned in my journey that I'm enough for me. I'm enough for me. And when I fill my space up, I really don't care. I love what I do. I love writing books. I love having these conversations. I've got another book kind of coming out of the ethers that might take that heroine's journey one step further. And so it is about the relationship. Sometimes the biggest one we'll ever have is the one with ourselves.
Well, we're with us 24/7, right?
We are
so
indeed. We have
to get that right. So it's very important. But well, this has been a fascinating conversation. This is another one where, Cameron goes to therapy and spills a bunch of personal details. But why don't you let us know? Why don't you let us know where people can get the book and where they can interact with you online?
Well, it's on Amazon. I've got a website, Bodhi Moore. That's BOADIMOORE.com. Bodhi Moore. That's my author website. But if you're looking for Healing Your Attachment Wounds by Bodhi Moore, you'll find it on Amazon. There's also another book that goes with that, Women Going Sober. And that's part of the series. So I think that is part of once you start healing your attachment wounds, the Women Going Sober book's got some great. Both of my books are guides. They're not just information. They provide you with the ways and means to heal, and so it is a workbook in itself. So yes, bodhimoore.com.
No, that's tremendous. That's tremendous. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Have a beautiful day, what's left of it.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.